My name is Elena Carter. I'm 30 years old. Last Thanksgiving, my mother handed out gifts around the dinner table, as if the entire evening were a holiday show and everyone else had been invited to win something. My sister Sophie opened a gold necklace. My father unwrapped a new watch. My Aunt Lorraine received a spa voucher. Even my cousin's boyfriend, a guy who had only come over for pie, walked away with a gift bag. Then my mother looked at me. "You should be grateful we still let you sit here," she said. The table laughed. She slid a white envelope across the table. "Actually, we did get Elena something." Inside wasn't a gift. It was a legal authorization packet making me financially responsible for our family's charity gala. Everyone else got presents. I got liability. 7 days later, those same people were standing outside my apartment door in Boston, because something they built on my name had already started collapsing. Thanksgiving wasn't the moment everything started. It was the moment everything finally became visible. In the Carter family, roles were assigned early and rarely questioned. Everyone knew who they were supposed to be in the story my mother liked to present to the world. My younger sister Sophie was the pride of the family. She played piano beautifully, spoke confidently at school events, and had a natural talent for making people like her within minutes. Whenever guests visited our house, Sophie was the one my mother introduced first. "This is my daughter Sophie," she would say proudly. "She's extraordinary." My mother, Patricia Carter, played a different role in that story. She was the heart of every charity event in our town, the woman who organized fundraisers, planned galas, and spoke passionately about helping the community. People admired her for that. They called her generous, compassionate, and tireless. My father, Daniel Carter, was the peacekeeper. If tension appeared during family gatherings, he smoothed it over with jokes or gentle reminders that family should always stay together. And then there was me. My place in the family story was less glamorous. I was the person who fixed problems. When something complicated appeared, I was the one expected to solve it quietly. Looking back, I can see the pattern started very early. When I was 17, I received a scholarship for designing a student data system at my high school. It was the kind of achievement that usually comes with proud photos and family celebrations. My mother didn't attend the ceremony. Sophie had a piano recital the same evening, and my mother told me the recital was more important. "I'm sure you understand," she said. At 23, I built the website and donor database for my mother's annual charity gala. I spent weeks designing the registration system, connecting the payment processing, and making sure sponsors could track their contributions online. On the night of the event, my mother stood on stage thanking the volunteers. She gestured toward my Aunt Lorraine and said, "Denise and I worked so hard on the technical side to make all of this possible." I was standing 10 feet behind her. My name was never mentioned. At 27, one of the event's major donors asked who managed the donor database. Before I could answer, my mother smiled politely and said, "We have people who help with that." People. That was the word she used. Not my daughter, not Elena, just someone behind the curtain. For years, I accepted that role without questioning it, because even if my family didn't say it out loud, they relied on me constantly. Whenever something complicated appeared, a contract that needed reading, a payment system that needed fixing, a technical issue with the donor database, the same phrase would eventually surface. "Elena will handle it." And I usually did. But Thanksgiving that year was different. My mother had been planning something larger than usual. The family charity gala was expanding, with more sponsors and a larger venue. The event was being presented as a major community fundraiser, something that would strengthen the Carter family's reputation as leaders in local philanthropy. That night, the dining table looked exactly like it always had during holidays. Turkey in the center, candles burning. My mother smiling as she handed out small wrapped boxes to everyone around the table. The mood was light, almost theatrical. My sister opened a gold necklace and hugged my mother. My father admired a new watch. My Aunt Lorraine held up her spa voucher and laughed. Then my mother turned toward me. "You should be grateful we still let you sit here," she said. Several people chuckled as if it were harmless family humor. Then she slid a white envelope across the table. "Actually," she added, "we did get Elena something." Inside the envelope were legal authorization forms, financial oversight confirmation, donor payment authorization, compliance responsibility. It took only a few seconds for me to understand what the documents meant. If anything went wrong with the gala finances, donor funds, reporting, or payment processing, the person legally responsible would be me. The room waited for my reaction. I looked at the papers once more, then placed them back in the envelope. "Good to know," I said. That was all I said. But in that moment, something changed, because for the first time, I decided to look carefully at the system my family expected me to protect. That night, after Thanksgiving dinner ended and everyone went home satisfied with their gifts, I returned to my apartment and opened my laptop. The envelope my mother had given me was still in my bag. I placed it on the desk and read through the documents again. Financial oversight confirmation, donor payment authorization, compliance responsibility. 3 separate forms, each structured to do the same thing. Place my professional credentials at the center of the charity gala's financial system. If something went wrong, my name would appear first. I work as a nonprofit compliance and financial systems consultant. My job is to design and monitor the infrastructure that keeps charitable organizations legally safe. That includes donor databases, payment processing systems, reporting frameworks, and regulatory compliance. In other words, I understand exactly how a charity operation is supposed to function. And that night, I decided to see how my family's gala was actually running. I logged into the donor management portal I had originally built for the Carter Foundation 3 years earlier. The system still used the structure I designed: sponsor accounts linked to payment gateways, donor tracking dashboards, and automated compliance reports generated at the end of each fundraising cycle. At first glance, everything looked normal. Sponsor pledges had been entered into the system. Several large donations were already marked as pending. Vendor contracts for catering, printing, and venue reservations were attached to the administrative panel. But the deeper I looked, the more something felt wrong. The first thing I noticed was the payment routing. All incoming donor contributions were passing through a payment gateway connected to a consulting account registered under my company's name. That account existed originally for technical setup and system testing, but it had never been intended to process full event transactions. Yet someone had connected it to the active donor payment flow, which meant every financial movement tied to the gala appeared to pass through infrastructure associated with me. Next, I opened the sponsor contract folder. Several of the agreements carried digital confirmation signatures, confirmations verifying that the financial reporting system had been reviewed for compliance. Those confirmations also carried my credentials, the same credentials my mother had just asked me to attach legally to the gala. Then I opened the compliance reporting module. Every scheduled audit summary, every financial verification field, and every system authorization line pointed back to one name: mine. If a regulatory review ever occurred, the first person investigators would contact would not be my mother, my aunt, or anyone on the charity committee. It would be me. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. For a moment, I wondered whether this was simply poor system management. Then I opened the internal committee email archive. The search function returned several recent messages between my mother and my Aunt Lorraine. One line stood out immediately: "Don't mention Elena unless someone specifically asks." I read it again. Another email followed 2 days later. "Her name makes the finances look credible." That sentence changed everything. The realization arrived quietly but clearly. Inside this system, I wasn't a daughter. I was insurance. My professional reputation, my credentials, my compliance history, my systems expertise had been placed at the foundation of the gala's financial structure. As long as my name appeared in the documentation, sponsors and donors would assume everything had been professionally verified. But the moment something went wrong, the responsibility would fall directly on me. I closed the email window slowly, Then I opened a new one. The message I wrote was short and formal, effective immediately. I am withdrawing all financial oversight related to the Carter Foundation Gala. My payment authorization credentials are revoked. My compliance verification access is terminated. My name may no longer be used in association with any financial documentation connected to this event. I sent the email to every person connected to the gala's operational structure: the committee chair, the payment processor, the sponsor coordinator, the event treasurer. Once the messages were sent, I logged back into the system one last time. I removed my access credentials from the compliance dashboard. I disabled the payment authorization gateway linked to my consulting account, and I revoked the verification certificates attached to my name. No warnings, no dramatic messages, just a quiet removal of the system's foundation. Then I closed the laptop, because if my family wanted the gala to continue without me, I was finally ready to see what happened when they tried to stand on their own. The first sign that the system had begun to react came less than 2 hours after I sent the withdrawal email. I was finishing a routine client report when my phone vibrated with a new message notification. The sender was the payment processor responsible for handling the charity gala's donor transactions. The subject line was simple: transaction approvals paused. Inside the email was a short explanation. Because the financial authorization connected to my credentials had been revoked, the payment gateway attached to the gala's donor portal had automatically suspended transaction approvals until a new compliance authority could be confirmed. In other words, money could no longer move through the system. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. This time it was the sponsor coordinator for the event. Her voice sounded confused. "We were told you oversee compliance for the Carter Gala," she said. "The payment system just flagged something." "I don't oversee it anymore," I replied calmly. There was a pause. "Oh," she said quietly, "that might be a problem." It didn't stop there. By mid-afternoon, the emails started arriving in waves. The florist wrote first. They were finalizing arrangements for the centerpieces and wanted confirmation that the deposit had been processed. Next came the printing company responsible for event programs and donor recognition materials. Their production schedule depended on financial verification tied to the system I had built. Then the venue manager contacted me. The message was polite but direct. "We were informed you manage operational compliance for the event. Could you confirm who is handling that role now?" Every message asked the same question in slightly different wording. Who is handling operations now? For the first time since Thanksgiving, the system my family depended on was asking for an answer they didn't have. Later that evening, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from my sister Sophie. "Mom says you're humiliating the family," she wrote. I stared at the message for a moment. Then I locked my phone and placed it on the desk without replying. An hour later, my father requested a video call. I accepted. The image that appeared on the screen showed the living room of my parents' house. Decorations were already being prepared for the upcoming gala. Garland hung unevenly across a staircase railing, and several boxes of event materials sat open on the floor. My father looked tired. "We need to fix this quietly," he said. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked a single question. "Did anyone apologize?" My father looked down at the floor for a moment. "That's not the point right now," he said finally. I nodded once. Then I ended the call. The next day, the situation became more complicated. The charity's committee chair, Eleanor Pike, began reviewing printed promotional materials that had already been distributed around town. On the event programs and sponsorship packets, one line appeared clearly beneath the financial section: Elena Carter, Financial Oversight. But when donors asked my mother about the event's technical management, she'd apparently been telling people something very different. "Elena barely helps," she reportedly said. Those two statements didn't match, and people started noticing. By Thursday afternoon, another problem surfaced. Someone had uploaded a short video clip from Thanksgiving onto Facebook. It was only 12 seconds long. But in those 12 seconds, my mother's voice could be heard clearly. "Be grateful you still get a seat." The clip spread quickly through the small circles that followed local charity events and community fundraisers. Comments began appearing beneath it. Some were simple questions. Who handles the scholarship funds for the Carter Gala? Others were more direct. Why was Elena removed if she was overseeing the finances? Within 48 hours, the Carter family had lost control of the narrative they had carefully built. For years, my mother had presented the charity gala as a symbol of generosity and community leadership. But now, two conflicting stories were circulating at the same time. In one version, I barely participated in the event. In the other, the entire financial system had just collapsed the moment I stepped away, and people were starting to wonder which one was true. For the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, the Carter family wasn't managing the story anymore. The story was managing them. The knock on my apartment door came early Saturday morning. It had been exactly 1 week since Thanksgiving. I was in the kitchen making coffee when the sound echoed through the hallway again. Louder this time, impatient and uneven, like someone who believed they had the right to be let in. At first I assumed it was a delivery, but when the knocking continued, I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. 4 familiar faces stared back at me. My mother, Patricia Carter. My father, Daniel. My sister, Sophie. And my aunt, Lorraine. For a moment, none of us moved. Then my mother leaned closer to the door. "Elena," she said sharply, "open the door." I unlocked it but left the chain latch in place. The door opened just wide enough for us to see each other clearly, while still keeping a small strip of metal between us. "What are you doing here?" I asked calmly. My father stepped forward first. In his hands was a large banker's box filled with folders and loose documents. The edges of several printed reports stuck out from the top. "We need to talk," he said. After a brief pause, I unlatched the chain and stepped aside. They entered my apartment without waiting for permission. No one said hello, no one apologized. The tension followed them inside like a storm cloud. My Aunt Lorraine was the first to speak. "The committee froze reimbursements," she said immediately. Her voice carried the tone of someone describing a technical inconvenience, not the collapse of a public charity event. My father placed the banker's box on my kitchen table and began pulling documents from inside it. "We need you to sign a few clarification forms," he said. I didn't sit down. "What kind of clarification?" I asked. My father slid several pages across the table. The first document stated that I remained responsible for managing the financial infrastructure connected to the Carter Foundation Gala. The second form described certain expense irregularities as administrative mistakes, requiring confirmation from the financial oversight consultant, which meant me. The third document requested the reactivation of the payment gateway connected to my compliance credentials. I read the papers slowly. Then I looked up. That was the moment everything became clear. They hadn't come to Boston because they missed me. They hadn't come because of family. They had come because the gala was collapsing, and they needed the system I built to stand back up again. Without a word, I walked to my desk and opened a drawer. Inside was a folder I had prepared 2 days earlier. I carried it to the table and placed it in front of them. "What's this?" my mother asked. "Documentation," I replied. My father opened the folder first. Inside were several financial summaries I had exported from the gala's back-end system. Highlighted sections marked the issues clearly: duplicate reimbursement claims submitted under separate expense categories, donor contributions redirected toward personal purchases, sponsor funds categorized under operational adjustments. The room grew quiet as the pages turned. Then I slid another document across the table, a presentation file, the sponsor pitch deck used to recruit major donors for the gala. I recognized every slide, because I had designed the entire document 3 years earlier. My Aunt Lorraine flipped to the title page. At the bottom corner, under authorship credits, one name appeared: Lorraine Carter. She froze. My father looked up slowly. That's just how the presentation was formatted, Lorraine said quickly. I opened the PDF version of the file and scrolled to the internal notes. One line sat clearly in the comment history. Don't mention Elena unless asked. The silence in the room thickened. Lorraine's face turned red. Everyone shifts expenses, she snapped suddenly. That's how these events work. I shook my head. Not under my professional license. My mother slammed her hand lightly against the table. You're destroying this family, she said. For the first time since they arrived, her voice cracked with real anger. I met her eyes. No, I said quietly. I stopped protecting it. The room fell silent again, because for the first time, everyone understood the same thing. The Carter Family Charity Gala had never been standing on generosity alone. It had been standing on the system I built, and that system was no longer holding them up. The fallout didn't happen overnight. For the first few days after my family left my apartment in Boston, the situation remained strangely quiet. No more angry phone calls arrived. No messages appeared in the family group chat. It was as if everyone involved had suddenly realized that continuing the argument publicly would only make things worse. But silence doesn't stop consequences. It only delays them. About 2 weeks after that Saturday morning, the charity committee overseeing the Carter Foundation Gala announced an independent financial audit. The decision came from the board's legal advisors who had reviewed the documentation conflicts surrounding the event's payment systems and donor reporting. Once auditors began examining the records, the problems became impossible to ignore. Several reimbursement claims appeared twice under different expense categories. Sponsor funds had been redirected to cover personal costs unrelated to the gala. Financial documentation that was supposed to confirm compliance had been submitted without proper authorization. None of those discoveries were technically catastrophic on their own, but together they created a picture the charity board could not defend publicly. 6 weeks after Thanksgiving, the official decisions arrived. The gala was suspended indefinitely while the organization restructured its financial oversight policies. Major donors requested detailed clarification about how their contributions had been handled. Several sponsors quietly withdrew their support until the audit finished. The Carter family's carefully polished image as the town's perfect charity leaders began to unravel. My mother, Patricia Carter, stepped down from her position as public chair of the gala committee. My aunt Lorraine resigned from the civic advisory board she had served on for years. Several expense reimbursements connected to the event were formally requested to be repaid. For the first time in decades, the Carter name was no longer associated with flawless charity events and polished fundraising speeches. It was associated with questions, and questions have a way of lingering. Strangely enough, the most unexpected call I received during that time did not come from anyone in my family. It came from a member of the charity board itself. Her name was Eleanor Pike. She spoke calmly and directly. "We reviewed the way you handled your withdrawal from the system," she said. "It was extremely professional." I didn't say much in response. There wasn't much to add. After a short pause, she continued. "We're restructuring the financial systems for several partner organizations," she explained. "One of them is a National Arts Foundation. They're looking for someone with experience building compliance infrastructure for large donor networks." She asked if I would be interested. I accepted the contract in January. A month later, I signed the closing papers on a small condominium in Boston. The process was quiet and uncomplicated. No large gatherings, no family group chats, no arguments about responsibility, just a single signature on a set of documents that belonged entirely to me. The strange thing about walking away from a system like the one my family built is that people often expect some dramatic ending. They imagine shouting matches, courtroom battles, or emotional confrontations that finally settle everything. But that's rarely how real life works. Sometimes the most powerful shift happens much more quietly. One person simply stops holding up a structure that was never meant to rest on them in the first place. And once that support disappears, the structure reveals what it was always made of. If you believe respect should never come with humiliation, and that sometimes protecting your peace means walking away from people who share your last name, then stories like this probably feel familiar. Boundaries are not revenge. They are simply self-respect finally telling the truth. And sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is refuse to keep carrying other people's lies. If stories like Elena's resonate with you, consider subscribing, because more stories like this are coming.